But actually, this whole program today came about because Tonit Calaway called me one day and said, I think this would be an interesting program to have to talk about what's happened with the President's Commission on Community Policing, what's been happening within Milwaukee, and to bring Tracey to town, who's very well known in this area, and have our police chief as well, to have a robust discussion about what's going on in Milwaukee, as well as having Judge Swanson join us. So I really appreciate Tonit's efforts on this. She's a vice president of human resources at Harley-Davidson and the president of the Harley-Davidson Foundation. She's also a real spark plug in the community and innovator, and I appreciate her efforts because she's been an early investor in many of the GMC projects for us as well, everything from the Downtown Task Force to Teach Town to Mike, and appreciate her belief in what we're doing, as well as and I will say she's an early investor. She's also a taskmaster. She wants to know what we've done with the money. So, Tonit, would you please come up to the stage?
You know, first of all, I just want to give a shout out to Julia and her team. What Julia didn't tell you is we were at Bel Air having tequila when we talked about this and how important these issues are for our community. You know, for Harley-Davidson, Matt and the rest of the leadership team, as well as our employees, are deeply concerned about our community. We're very committed to our community, as are all of you, and I know this issue with crime and violence is a big deal for us. And the more we talk about it and the more we are committed to making a change and supporting it, the bigger chance we have of turning the tides. And one of the things I think for me that was important is we don't always value who and what we have already in play trying to make these changes. So, you know, I got the honor of introducing the panel, and I'm going to start with Rob here, who's going to be our moderator. And Rob Henken is president of the Public Policy Forum. Since joining the forum in January of 2008, he has authored or co-authored 4 reports that have won national awards from the Governmental Research Association. He was also named one of Milwaukee's 100 most influential leaders in the Business Journal annual Power Book in 2012, and one of Milwaukee's Game Changers by M Magazine in 2013. So Rob, thank you for moderating this panel. It's going to be great. Now I'm going to talk about the panel. I'm going to tell you right up front, I am completely biased by all 3 of the people that are on this panel. And you'll know more when I go through the introductions. The first one is Chief Flynn. And I have to tell you, Harley-Davidson is deeply grateful to Chief Flynn and his organization because they've been huge partners with us on the Near West Side work that we're doing, and for all of our other corporate sponsors. Whenever we make an ask, he is there. His officers are there. They have a tough job. You know, while we deal with these issues from an employee standpoint, from a location standpoint, he's dealing with it every minute of the day, as are his police officers. And he's got a national presence. One of the reasons I know Chief Flynn well is because of Tracey. And Tracey is in a national world dealing with crime and policing and gender. And I'm not sure we all know how big his presence is nationally. It is pretty huge, and he's very well respected. Not to mention what he does here every day. I'm going to go over the bio, but I'm a huge fan, so I've already given you the disclaimer, I'm biased. But our chief was appointed in 2008. This past January, he was sworn in for his 3rd term. I had the honor of being there, as did Mayor BARETT. He commands an agency of 2,000 sworn officers and 700 civilians, serving a city of more than 600,000 residents. Before coming to Milwaukee, Chief Flynn was former Secretary of Public Safety in Massachusetts. He serves on the Executive Committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and Fight Crime, Invest in Kids Executive Board. He is also a member of the Harvard Kennedy School's Executive Session on Policing and a past recipient of the prestigious Gary Hayes Memorial Award for Police Leadership from the Police Executive Research Forum. So one of the things also said about Chief Flynn is he's brilliant, as are all the panelists, and he knows how to take data and apply it practically. He is also a person that believes definitely in process and adhering to that. And for that, I'm eternally grateful, and for all the other work you and your officers do. So Police Chief Flynn, we are excited to have you, and if you want to step up, that'd be great. So Tracey, I don't actually know how to really give you Tracey's bio. Tracey's brilliant. I met Tracey in law school. She was a year ahead of me, so she is older. That is the one thing I'm going to point out. And when it comes to brilliant people, I thought I was smart until I attended University of Chicago and realized I'm not actually that smart. I'm okay. But there's brilliant people, and I had the chance to meet them, and she is one of them. And on a national scale, her research on crime, policing, and race, is very well known. And I'm going to read her amazing profile as well. She is a Walton, Hale, Hamilton Professor of Law at Yale University. In 2015, she was named a member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. And in addition, she was enlisted by the Department of Justice for the launch of the National Initiative for Building Community Trust in Justice. As part of that initiative, she and Professor Tom Tyler launched a collaborative for justice policy innovation. So with that, Tracey, thank you for coming and flying in to see us and talk to us. And the last, yeah, thank you. Well, and the last panelist is just difficult. Of everyone gave us their bios, he chose not to give me a bio. So he has to deal with what he gets. He is Honorable David Swanson. He graduated from Northwestern University as a Middle Eastern Studies student. He speaks Arabic, Spanish, and French, but he will deny all of those. He served proudly in the first Gulf War as a U.S. naval officer on the Carl Vinson. In public policy, I'm not sure he would describe himself like this, but he's a man who is deeply committed to the community. Public service is his calling. And you know, it's reflected in his very being. This is even too much for me, actually. And you'll know why I'm saying this in a bit. He has been a tax attorney for several of the firms here, great firms. And, you know, public service called him again, and he became he sat on the State Tax Appeals Commission, and then he ran for judge. I will tell you, you guys call him Judge Swanson, I call him Judge Swanee. I am proud to say that I'm married to this man, and he's served in the Children's Court Juvenile Division, or Criminal Division, and so he's got a real perspective on what I think is a really big problem in the city, and that is what we do with our juveniles, delinquency and crime, and as the mayor has spoken to us about that, it has become a bigger issue. And if you pay attention to the news, a lot of the violence and criminal activity is in that group of people. So with no further ado, Judge Swanson. And I look forward to thank you all.
So thank you, Tonit, and good afternoon, everybody. You know, I was sitting there stewing. I was wondering why my introduction wasn't as warm as Judge Swanson's, but then I got to the punchline, so I knew that anyway. So we have about 35 minutes or so that we're going to do a panel conversation. We do want to make sure that we leave some opportunity for the audience to answer or to ask some questions to our panelists. So I am going to ask our panelists to be brief in their responses. We're going to start broad. We're then going to hopefully narrow down into some issues that are raised in their responses to my initial questions. Chief Flynn, I'm going to start with you. As we all know, Milwaukee has seen a well-publicized spike in homicides and auto thefts in recent months, which led at least two of the candidates in the recent mayoral campaign to say or imply that the city is unsafe. I have a two-part question for you to get us started. First, what's your response to that sentiment? And second, how much can policing strategy impact crime rates as opposed to other strategies, such as that the mayor mentioned, that are outside of the realm of law enforcement? Chief Flynn.
So that's a two-part question you want me to be brief about that covers virtually everything we're here to talk about.
That's why you got the big bucks, Chief.
Okay, all right. Well, the first one is yes, and the second one is we don't know. Yeah, we did have a significant increase in violent crime last year, particularly our homicide rate. It ultimately went up by 70% in 1 year. Over the course of the preceding 7 years, we achieved 6 of the lowest homicide totals the city's had in a quarter of a century. And then we had last year. I was at a meeting of the Major City Chiefs Organization late last year, and it was convened because the members of the 50 largest cities were seeing similar circumstances in their cities. A number of those cities, particularly St. Louis, similar to Milwaukee's situation, had states that had recently dramatically loosened their firearms laws. As a matter of fact, that discussion's pretty much been lost by the big city chiefs, as state after state has raced into weakened gun laws in order to provide everybody the maximum access to the maximum number of firearms. And then they're shocked to see violent crime go up. So it was a tough year. We sat around and we looked at it. We looked at the dramatic homicide increases in Washington, D.C., dramatic in St. Louis, dramatic in Memphis, dramatic in Baltimore, dramatic in Cincinnati. City after city after city was seeing increases in non-fatal shootings, homicides, and robberies. And we were trying to look for some commonalities. Many of us were, dealing with the aftermath of the concerns about what was seen in Ferguson, but I raised that less as, our officers were no longer doing our job, but rather two related issues. One, the resurfacing of the issue of, quote, mass incarceration, which has put a lot of implicit pressure on prosecutors everywhere to reduce the number of people being sentenced for crimes. Now, that is commendable if we're talking about like crimes that don't have violent victims. Our problem is we've got a large number of people who got locked up for, quote, nonviolent crimes with extensive criminal jackets. Extensive violent jackets. Those are the kinds of people that disproportionately suffered from the drug laws, because having the drug got them the sentence. Alas, in many states, having the gun didn't. So in those circumstances, there were increases in incarcerations for certain levels of offenders. There's been a retrenchment, understandable. Society wants to examine how we're using this very expensive component of the criminal justice system. Are we using it fairly? Is it colorblind? Important conversations. But while that's going on, an awful lot of states are releasing a number of offenders back into the community who do not have services upon their return. And this is a big part of the conversation that concerns the city chiefs. We're all old enough to remember the mass deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill in the 70s. All right? What was found that these mental institutions often were cruel, badly run, dirty, unsanitary, weren't helping the people in there, and many people in there weren't a danger to themselves or the community. So the cure was to close these institutions en masse nationally and develop a network of community-based mental health facilities. Well, guess what happened? The community-based mental health facilities are park benches, bridges, jail, and homeless shelters. All right? Mental illness got delegated to the criminal justice system. There was nothing to take them. And the concern of the chiefs isn't the notion that people are being released from prison, because they all come back. Our concern is very few states have any funding for meaningful reentry services for the people that are coming back to the very neighborhoods they were victimizing. All right? To environments in which there are not jobs waiting for them. They do not have job training, and the soup of issues that brought them into this life of crime remain waiting for them. So although the conversation is important, talking about deinstitutionalizing our offenders is meaningless for the safety of individual neighborhoods if we are not equally engaged in a robust discussion about reentry services for those who are returning. It's essential. It's not happening. This is not just about taking the money savings. Now, there's talk in the criminal justice about something called justice reinvestment, which is you close down jails and prisons, or at least lighten the load, that these programs can now be funded. All right? My experience with government is if people can take the tax savings, they'll take it. And we're not going to get the reinvestment. So those conversations have to occur. They're equally as important as feeling good about reducing incarceration. And if they don't occur, the people that are going to suffer the most are the same neighborhoods now that are plagued by extraordinary high rates of violence. I'll give you a real quick, and then I've forgotten the second part of the question. 53206, we hear about it all the time, right? And we always hear about it as the zip code with the highest rate of incarceration in Wisconsin. It is going to be the one that's going to be part of the porthole, sharing their experiences, no doubt, with the highest crime zip code of Newark, New Jersey. Okay? Here's our challenge. What nobody ever mentions about 53206 is the homicide victimization rate in 53206 is 250 per 100,000. The national rate is 4. The Milwaukee rate is 14. So yes, there's a lot of people going to jail from 53206. Why? Because the people who are saddled with the dreadful poverty background that forces them to live in 53206 are getting murdered, robbed, burgled at extraordinary rates. And so, the conversation has to occur at the same time. We cannot talk about our sometimes ham-handed criminal justice responses to these complicated social processes without disaggregating those processes and looking at the components of them. 53206 will be ill-served if people released to it from prison are not provided the services they need for successful transition.
So Chief Flynn, obviously a lot of elements that we want to dive deeper into. I want to turn next to you, Tracey. One of the points that the Chief did mention, and I knew I should have just thrown out my prepared questions because there'd be so much for me to just follow up with. But the Chief did raise the resource issue. Mm-hmm. You wrote an op-ed for the New York Times recently. You said, quote, "The idea that most residents of high-crime neighborhoods require that there be a cop on every street corner to be compliant with the law is untrue and insulting." So to what extent, in terms of your national perspective, is the number of cops on the street an issue as opposed to all sorts of other elements?
When did I write that? No, seriously, I remember. I actually think I love having conversations with Ed. And we spent how many years? 6 years in the Harvard executive sessions.
I don't think we agreed once.
No,
we did.
Most of the time we did agree. And I actually think that that question that you just posed dovetails nicely with the points that the Chief was making. I mean, first of all, I just want to start out by saying one thing about these spikes across this city and other cities. I always find it interesting, and I am sure that, please understand when I say what I'm about to say, that I'm not trying to say that what's happening in Milwaukee isn't very serious. It's often problematic when you do the kind of work that I do to look at a 70% increase from last year, which is why I thought it was very helpful and important that Chief Flynn also said that before this last spike, you experienced 6 years of very low rates. I think I heard that correctly, right? So in my world, what we say is this, that you don't have a trend without 3 data points, 3. So when you compare last year to this year, that's just 2 data points. That's not a trend. And so trying to come to conclusions about what's going on when you just have 2 data points is really difficult and problematic. It's not to say that the issues that Chief Flynn was bringing up with respect to gun laws and other things, aren't critical and important and don't have long-standing impacts. Just our ability to say that those things have anything to do with what's going on between now and last year is just almost impossible to say. Now, the reason why I wrote what I wrote about that is because we know, again, from decades of research, that the most important components of why people obey the law is not the extent to which they are threatened for failure to obey the law, right? So if you think that the reason why a person is going to obey the law is because they see a cop on the corner and because they fear the consequences of failing to obey the law, it's true that deterrence has something to do with people's likelihood of compliance, but a much more powerful reason for compliance is either that people just think it's the right thing to do to obey the law, or, and this is where my research comes in, they think that government has the right to tell them what to do. The idea that people comply with the law because they think that government has the right to tell them what to do is what social psychologists call legitimacy. And by this, I'm talking about a positive conception of that, not a normative philosophical conception, just that what we notice that it takes to get people to comply. 4 things seem to matter. That people are treated with dignity and respect. So it's really not good, Mayor, when the cop tells you to stop or I'm going to blow your head off, right? You know, in the immediate context, it might cause you to stop, but over the long term, that kind of conversation between a police officer and a person is not going to encourage them to comply. Second, people care about being able to assess whether decision-making is fair, transparent, and neutral. So again, if we're talking about police officers, we want police officers to explain what they're doing. We want those explanations to be grounded in fact. When a police officer stops someone, they should be able to say why they are stopping someone and not just say, stop because I told you to. Third, people really like to be able to give their side of the story in an interaction or to have input into policies. We call that voice. And what's interesting about this third factor is it's important even when telling your side of the story doesn't even make a difference to the outcome. And last, people look for indicia when they're dealing with individuals in legal authority over them, so let's just say police, that is a person that they can expect to treat them benevolently in the future. That seems like a kind of squishy catch-all, and in some ways it is, but it has to do with the extent to which often people in your group have been treated by police in the past, or judges in courts, Judge Swanson, being willing to acknowledge mistakes, past transgressions. I can say more about that. These 4 factors are called procedural justice, and procedural justice is the sort of bedrock foundation of legitimacy. Now, those ideas are why I said what I said, because those things, that is, how you are treated by police matters more than the fact that the police officer is there, is what matters most to the public in terms of encouraging compliance. And the idea that you have to have a cop on every block threatening to shake someone down in order to ensure that they comply with the law is insulting, because it means that you actually can't count on people to obey the law. Last thing I will say is, even in communities like 53206, most people obey the law most of the time, and it's important to remember that.
Thank you, Tracey. So let's get Judge Swanson involved. Judge, the recent rash of car thefts and carjackings in Milwaukee, many of which have been committed by teens, has led some city officials, including a couple in this room, to question the performance of the juvenile justice system and, in particular, the quick release of teenagers who are repeatedly arrested. As a children's court judge, do you feel that's a legitimate concern? And if so, does the problem lie with the judiciary or with other elements of the system?
So, all right. So I get to assign blame here, which is what I do every day. But I think I don't agree that there is sort of a quick release program going on at children's court at all. I handled a juvenile delinquency calendar for 2 years. And what I saw there were a number of problems in the programming that is being provided to juveniles outside the court. So for any judge in a juvenile court, there's a very narrow range of options available to you. For the most serious cases, the juvenile can be waived into adult court, and the DA's office asks for that on a regular basis for the most serious cases. The most serious sentence in juvenile court, we call it a disposition that can be handed down, is what we call a serious juvenile offender sentence. It's a maximum 5 years, 3 years of confinement, and 2 years of probation. After that, the next step down would be a maximum of 2 years. There's only one juvenile correctional facility in the state. That's called the Lincoln Hill School for Boys. It's co-located with the only juvenile facility for girls. That's called the Copper Lake School. Both of those facilities are located in Irma, Wisconsin, which is near Rhinelander. So that gives you an idea of what the problems might be with our juvenile correctional system right now. We only have this one facility, and it's been in the press a lot lately, and it's been in the press because it's failing, and it's failing for a number of reasons. But I think probably the number one reason is that it's located in a place where they simply cannot hire enough trained staff to deal with the kids who are being sent there. We are handing down plenty of sentences that send kids to Lincoln Hills, and they're not working. We have about a 2/3 recidivism rate for kids coming out of Lincoln Hills. That means within 3 years, these kids are reoffending. So when you say, well, we're not handing down a serious enough sentence, we're looking at a system where we know there's a 2/3 chance of failure on day one. And that's a system that is simply not working. If we're going to look at options then outside of corrections, we have, again, a very narrow range of possibilities. We can order probation. Now, most of the research says that probation with services is the most effective way to deal with juvenile crime. Now, that doesn't always play out that way, unfortunately, because the services, again, are inadequate. We're not seeing enough, well, both for kids who are released from Lincoln Hills and sent back here on probation, the services being provided through the Department of Corrections haven't been successful in many cases. We've seen similar situations for kids where when we're placing them on probation with services in the community. Now, we do have a couple of relatively successful programs. We have a program called Wraparound that I think has been fairly successful, but that's only for kids with mental health diagnoses. And even there, again, you send a kid with a mental health diagnosis back to the same neighborhood where he's had problems in the past. Even with services in the home, you tend to have problems in the future. Now, they're not always a problem, and of course, no one ever hears about the success stories. You only hear about the failures. But there has been...
Boy, do I know that feeling.
Yeah. But, this has been, it's an ongoing problem, and I really believe the number one problem that we have to deal with is the problem in our Department of Corrections. And until they address, and this is in Madison, we have to get some movement on reforming Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake and figuring out a way to provide, if that is going to be the juvenile facility, then they have to figure out a way to provide services there and then follow up here when those kids are released.
So let me tie your response into something that Chief Flynn said earlier. We have the Lincoln Hills situation. I don't think anybody is happy about what's been going on at Lincoln Hills, and I don't think there's anybody who doesn't feel that we need to fix that and that we potentially need to bring more kids back to Milwaukee. We have the issue of mass incarceration. Again, I don't think anybody feels like we should be putting more people behind bars. That's a question, an issue that needs to be addressed. But what's the right balance? Because in the end, can we safely bring all of the Milwaukee kids back from Lincoln Hills? Do we have the proven community-based alternatives to make that result in a safe community? And the same thing with mass incarceration. Are we in danger of potentially going too far? So let me start with you, Chief Flynn.
Well, I think there's a couple issues I want to address right here because we're at the rebuttal phase of our discussion. Okay? One is to Tracey's point, because I understand philosophically what she's saying. The notion that we have to impose safety and order on a community is wrong-headed. It makes policing look like an occupying army, which nobody wants. The flip side of that is that neighborhoods that are characterized by high rates of violence have low amounts of social capital. They are socially disorganized neighborhoods who don't know each other, live in substandard housing, have reason to distrust each other because living amongst them are predators. They cannot organize, they cannot cohere, and they do not own their public space. The reason we put cops on bicycles and on foot patrols in those neighborhoods is to try to help create some notion of safe public space that neighborhoods can cohere in. Because there's no question that poverty not only is one of the factors in crime occurring, the amounts of poverty are increased by the amounts of crime because a reputation for violence drives out economic development and prevents additional economic and development and jobs from coming in. The first question I hear from a developer in Springfield, Mass, in Chelsea, Mass, or in Milwaukee, places that had pockets of high crime, are, will my employees and customers be safe here? They don't ask about the school system. Will we be safe here? And that reputation has a deadening impact on the ability of people in those neighborhoods to get after-school jobs, to get first jobs, or to get jobs that migrate to the suburbs and are ill-served by a transportation network. So, trying to turn that around by creating safe public spaces that neighbors can use and maybe then begin to cohere and create social capital is a key part of what we're trying to do here in Milwaukee and many similarly situated cities. Now, I know that's not the point she's speaking to, but I want to draw a distinction between having resources devoted to neighborhoods that are characterized by high rates of interpersonal violence and the difference between imposing order and trying to co-produce it. That's one. The second issue is issues of concern about the juvenile justice system. Mayor convened a meeting some time ago in which members of the juvenile justice system and the police and city services came together. The point of the meeting was the following. In the preceding year, we had arrested something on the order of 500 juvenile offenders for various crimes. We found there were about 60 of them who had been arrested for 3 or more felonies in 12 months. And our point was, we get most kids are going to age out of crime. We know most kids are going to have some sort of social safety network to keep them from becoming career criminals. But we know in every single social service business, less than 10% of the end number drives 60 to 80% of the problem. Can we not focus on N? And I'm saying right now our juvenile system is grossly failing focusing on that number driving them. Case in point, we had a murder over the homicide over the weekend. 16-year-old killed committing a holdup. He was arrested in March of 2014 for an armed robbery and arrested in May of 2015 for an armed robbery, and in April of 2016 he's dead. Now I say he's part of that small percentage that if we'd focused resources on them, we might have been able to at the very least incapacitate, but perhaps turn around. And if we treat all the juvenile offenders like they're status offenders, as opposed to the fact that some of them probably sexually or physically abused as small children. Let's not forget that part of this puzzle, all right? Where's the talk about social services when they're kids? Because those high-rate offenders that are extremely violent often have in their background serious issues of sexual or physical abuse when they were 3 to 8 years old. I don't see any game plans for that. So that's a piece that has to be looked at. But there's a bigger piece the judge addressed, and that's the issue of places like Lincoln Hills. And I say this, we need more than anything principled conservatives to help our state legislature understand the importance of investment in Milwaukee from a criminal justice point of view. Now, I say this without fear of retribution because I'm in my 3rd term, he's in his 4th. Guess what? For the last 8.5 years, this police department has wanted for nothing from this city. A city that is spending 70% of its tax income on public safety is doing its part. The state doesn't get to throw rocks at us and defund facilities for juvenile offenders and defund reentry services and release people from prison without sufficient resources and underinvest in the DA's office and keep DA's salaries at grotesque levels that drive out experienced DAs to other jobs. State's got to roll. It's not stepping up. And they're not going to listen to me, and they're not going to listen to the mayor. But they got to hear from business people who have a stake in this city, in this metropolitan area that says, yeah, crime's pulling Milwaukee down. What are you doing about it? Don't tell me you bought 3 ShotSpotter sensors. Yeah, thanks. What are you doing about abandoned houses we need to tear down and board up? What are you doing about social services for juvenile offenders for whom you're responsible? What are you doing about reentry services? All right? What are you doing about firearms laws that give concealed carry permits to career criminals? Okay? They've got to roll. They don't hear us. They need to hear people who say, okay, we got conservative values, but hey, okay? Criminal justice is not just a city responsibility. Huge amounts of state resources are presumably allotted to this, to every other component of the system. Cities funding the police department. If the rest of the system isn't funded, I can't ultimately even say it's any judge's fault that I've got committed offenders constantly returning to the streets of this city to commit more offenses against those neighborhoods least able to tolerate them.
So Tracey, my guess is that there's something that Chief Flynn said that you would like to respond to. I'll give you that opportunity, but
Seriously.
I'd also like to hear
that
some
was
national
really
perspective.
important.
Are there places that do this right?
So what was the first part of your question? Because I was too busy giving Chief Flynn much deserved applause on that. And I do hope look, I'm not from here, I don't know any of you people, but to the extent that you have some sway on this state issue, I can't tell you how important that is. That is actually a national issue. It's a national issue that policing agencies are funded by cities all over the country, and corrections are funded at the state level, and there's usually a political divide between the leadership of cities and the leadership of the state legislatures that fund both corrections and often prosecutors' offices. And to the extent that Milwaukee can be a leader in this regard, I think that would be great. But that wasn't your question. Go ahead.
You served on the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Lots of recommendations in that report. From a national perspective, are there best practices that are being employed in terms of public safety and policing in other places that your perception is we ought to be pursuing here?
All over, yeah. I mean, so the President's Task Force report, which your chief is very familiar with, he actually testified before us at one of the hearings. We had a whirlwind number of hearings and witnesses. We had convenings all over the country. The report is divided up into 6 pillars. The first one is building public trust and legitimacy. The second is sort of policy-oriented practices, mostly around use of force. The third was about mass demonstrations and social media. The fourth was about community policing. The fifth was about training. And the sixth is officer safety and wellness. Pillars 2 through 6 could have basically come in any order, but the foundation of the report was the first pillar, which was building public trust and legitimacy. And the organizing principle behind the first pillar was the research that I just tried to explain briefly in 2 minutes. And there are all sorts of things that can be done, are being done around the country to promote this in terms of police training, in terms of reorganizing agencies. I actually think your own chief is a leader in terms of the way that he's organized his agency, especially with respect to discipline. One could see that as a way of promoting procedural justice and legitimacy, but there is a number of recommendations that I think could be valuable in the report. So I'll just point out 2. The idea that a very small number of people drive most of the violence in every major city. That's not just Milwaukee. That is true as a general matter. And there are some nationally recognized approaches to identifying those folks, usually by using network analyses. My co-author and colleague Andrew Papachristos is a leader in this regard. It's important not only because it works, but when you are focusing on the right people, you are not using a blunderbuss, scattershot, choose your metaphor approach to using criminal justice resources, which in addition to not working, undermines the very aspects of procedural justice that I was talking about when you're trying to get lots of people into the system who actually aren't the ones driving the violence. It's not only not effective, it undermines public trust. So that's one. 2, there's another strategy that we talked about in the report, actually pioneered in New Haven, about using public health professionals to travel with police officers in trauma incidents. I don't know, do you guys do that?
We've got a pilot project in one of our districts.
Yeah.
It's the children exposed to violence
Exactly.
notion. Yeah.
So because the other issue that the chief was talking about, the fact that so many of these kids are exposed to all kinds of trauma, not just trauma in the home, but our research actually shows that being exposed to violence in your community, this is another paper that Andrew Papachristos has done, is associated, literally, we can quantify it, with days lost in school. So being exposed to one violent incident in your community is roughly equivalent to losing 3 months of school. And if you've got a community where people are experiencing a homicide rate of 250 per 100,000, that's, really there are no words for that rate. No words. I've not actually seen an area in a city that has a homicide rate that high. The highest homicide rate community that I've worked in my 20-year career was one in Chicago, and that was 80. 250 is like a third world country.
So clearly a central element of the President's task force is this notion of trust building and the importance of police-community relations. Judge Swanson, in terms of the delinquent youth that you're seeing every day, your thoughts on how the youth of Milwaukee view the Milwaukee Police Department?
That's a hard question to answer. By the time a case gets to court, obviously the kids are generally on their best behavior. They're not, and most of our criminal cases do result in guilty pleas. So at that point, actually very few criminal cases are contested in juvenile court. That said, certainly there's a disconnect, I think, between the police department and juveniles in Milwaukee. I don't think there's no one would be surprised to hear that. I really don't believe, though, that that's the root of the problem. I think, what Tracey was just talking about, and the chief too, is the overlap in what we're seeing in kids who are coming out of very chaotic home environments and criminal behavior. And that is something we would see on a daily basis. The judges who handle delinquency cases also handle what we call CHIPS cases, and CHIPS stands for Child in Need of Protection or Services. So those are kids who are being removed from their parents' home because they're not receiving adequate care, or there's some sort of neglect or abuse happening. There's an incredible overlap between delinquencies and CHIPS cases. We see the same families on both sides of that docket. I don't think, again, that wouldn't surprise anyone to hear that many of the kids we see who are committing crimes have been abused or neglected. And if we could address what's happening with these kids at a younger age, I think we'd see a much more progress than obviously we see when they're the first contact they have with someone who plays I'll just say a forceful role in their lives is when they see a police officer. I mean, that's a terrible situation for that, for a kid to be basically mired in chaos until it gets to the point where the police have to become involved. And what we really need to see is earlier intervention.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to get to your questions out in the audience. The question right back there.
I'll be loud. I won't get the mic. To this point, if there's a small number of folks that's going to drive a large portion of the problem, DC has implemented this policy where they're paying people like $10,000 a year that are in that small number of people driving problems. It's $10,000 a year they're paying people not to commit violent crimes. Can you comment on that program or maybe
I've heard of that program. I actually had a reporter from LA call me to ask me about it. But I don't know exactly what they're paying them. They're not just paying them not to commit crime. Like there's programming and services involved, right? I don't really know much about it other than what you just said.
I think the mayor wanted to respond.
Oh, okay.
I have a different question.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
As you all know, I love being the cheerleader for all the great things that are going on in the city. Now you're hearing to the other half of my life, welcome to my world, is what I'm saying in terms of the challenges that we face right here. When we were talking about, and I'm going to go back to the stolen vehicles to try to get even more granular as to what I perceive to be the problem. I understand, and Judge did a great job in explaining the difficulties we have with Lincoln Hills. That decision was made 4 or 5 years ago to close the institution in the southern part of the state. And now you've got this big problem in the northern part of the state. And in my sense is the judges are very reluctant to send kids up there. But as the judge mentioned, there's a resource issue short of that. And the problem that I perceive is that you've got kids who become repeat offenders. And if there are no local resources or very few local resources, and then the next option is Lincoln Hills, what happens? The judges are going to be using those limited resources, and we have these kids who are out there carjacking and stealing cars over and over again, and we're not doing the public a favor, and we're not doing them a favor if they don't have a meaningful consequence. And so I'm not here to say send kids to Lincoln Hills, but we, when I say we, the entire system has to come up with a meaningful alternative, local alternative, particularly for repeat offenders of this crime. Because if it's simply a release program, even with probation, as the judge said, there's a wraparound service, but the wraparound service is for kids with mental health issues. If you've got a kid who's just out there stealing cars or carjacking, you have to have a meaningful local alternative, short of Lincoln Hills, but it has to be something more than don't do that again. And that's my concern right now as to whether that exists in the real world right now. And this is an issue that the chief and I deal with on a weekly basis, looking at the small n, the n as the chief described it, and how we have meaningful consequences for n.
Yeah, it is, and it is a real challenge for us because some of us are old enough to think of stolen cars as just the notion that's joyriding from the 50s. You remember, some of you maybe back in the 80s when carjacking became the great fear crime of America and ended up with even federal statutes being passed to have sentences for them. It's back again. And it's our juvenile offenders who started out stealing cars and have found that carjacking is more fun. Now, I've looked, if you ever read the book The Tipping Point, this is a perfect tipping point phenomenon because we didn't gradually over the course of several years see an increase in stolen cars and carjackings, okay? As a matter of fact, for 6 consecutive years, stolen cars decreased until finally it was 50% of what it was the year before I got here. In 1 year, 2014, it went up 50%. Mid-year, it was up 100%. Overwhelmingly young offenders. Immature brains, having fun, driving like crazy. But what happens with a large phenomenon? There are subsets. Subset of my car thieves became carjackers with older offenders in the car. Subset of them became people using the jack cars to shoot people they were in competition with or in a feud with. And a subset of them have committed robberies and murders. It's an absolute gateway crime. Now this year so far, we're down 1% from last year, which we're like, hallelujah, we're finally beginning to turn this boat around. But we still have way too many juvenile car thefts, and virtually none of them face a consequence. Now, whether the consequence is enhanced services, aggressive home visits, but the juvenile probation system, you got to understand, half the juvenile probation workers are ex-bus drivers because they had bumping rights to become probation workers when they got laid off from their bus job 10 years ago. Okay? We don't have a cadre of dedicated people going into the community. My cops do more probation visits than anybody else does, just to knock on the door and say, how's Johnny? All right? We're doing it. We're filling that gap. So again, it's a system issue that has many funding sources that aren't doing their piece, and the neighborhoods most vulnerable to victimization. I mean, let's face it, do poor neighborhoods deserve less justice? Because poor neighborhoods are where the most of the victims are. Okay, it's not just about the offender. Okay, we're all offender focused. Oh, poor offender. What neighborhoods are the ones getting devastated by these crimes? I mean, you steal a guy's car in 53206, you've stolen his job. He can't take 3 days off to try to get a car registered and get a new car and try to figure out this and call up his boss. He's got a low-end job. They'll get somebody else. These things have consequences. So again, our challenge is right now, yeah, you've got an overcrowded Lincoln Hills badly managed that's not doing its job, and you've got probation except nobody's really paying attention. Okay? And then we wonder why young offenders don't learn a lesson from their arrest. I mean, we get young offenders now. We made our pursuit policy very restrictive after a number of innocent people were killed by the fleeing vehicle. Okay, all the chases were in policy, but the fleeing villain killed innocent people. So we said, okay, we're going to dial back pursuits on very specific issues.
You changed your policy.
We changed our policy. Deaths by pursuits practically disappeared. When this stolen car issue took off, you know what our young offenders were saying? You can't chase us. Because a simple stolen car was not enough for a pursuit and still isn't, unless that car has been taken in a robbery or used in a robbery. Last year, more people were killed by offenders driving stolen cars than were killed by robbers. Okay? That's what happens with these young offenders who lose nothing. This is exciting, thrilling, live, what's that video game? Something auto? Grand Theft Auto? I mean, I'm being serious, okay? And their brains are mush, right? You've had 14-year-old kids. Their brains are mush. But What lesson are they learning in their engagement in the criminal justice system? And
So,
right
Chief-
now, nothing.
I want to push back a little bit. The county is spending millions of dollars every year on alternatives to incarceration programs for delinquent youth. So I guess I'll ask you, Judge Swanson, is the problem that we don't have enough of these programs that provide good sentencing options for you? Is it that the programs aren't working? What is the situation that you face every day in terms of how to sentence kids?
What I would say the main problem we have right now is we have almost no residential options available in Milwaukee County, meaning that we don't have an option available for kids who are on a probation order with services other than to place them at home or group homes. And I don't know if any of you have had contact with group homes, but they are essentially open door policy. I mean, officially they're not, but unfortunately that's the way it works in many of these group homes. So these are kids who, if we don't send them to Lincoln Hills and we're not prepared to place them at home with their parents, one or either parent, depending on the situation, we really don't have an option available in county. We have a very small program called the Milwaukee County Accountability Program, it's a residential program at the Juvenile Detention Center, but it's a maximum of 24 kids, and it's full pretty much all the time. The option, and I wanted to get back to Lincoln Hills because that's come up a couple of times since I addressed it. One thing I want to emphasize is we are still sending kids to Lincoln Hills, unfortunately, because it's our only option. And again, that's our only juvenile facility in the state for corrections. We're sending about the same number of kids there per month as we were before all the investigations started. The problem is now we're sending them knowing that the services are completely inadequate. And this has just been coming to light over the last several months, but its official title is the Lincoln Hills School for Boys. We used to call these institutions reform schools, but we know, based on some of the investigations and some of interviews that have happened with people who have been on the staff and kids who have been coming out of there, is that the educational programs up there have virtually shut down for months at a time because they cannot staff them. So, again, we know sending kids up there that it's a recipe for failure. And we look at the options available locally, and we just don't have enough. We really need residential programming here in the county where we can have more contact with the kids, both with the school they'll be attending, the family members who are here, who are playing productive roles in their lives, and make sure that they remain connected to people here. Whereas, when we send them to Lincoln Hills, there's a huge concern that those ties wither because they're 4 or 5 hours away. That's a long drive. I don't know I'm sure most of you at some point have driven up to Rhinelander. In the winter, sometimes you can't get there, and in the rest of the year, it's a long, solitary drive, especially for people who often don't have great transportation options. So, again, we just need a local alternative.
So I regret to say, because I know there are so many questions in the audience, that we are out of time. Julia, maybe we can do a day-long event on this topic. We'll partner with you on that. But I want to thank our panelists. Can we have a round of applause, please?
The thing that he was talking about, the research shows that if you pay people and you actually pay them.
Rob, thank you for moderating. That was, and Tracey, Ed, and David, that was a terrific panel. I think that was one of the most insightful discussions we've had at the GMC in a long time. Thanks to the three of you for taking your time. We greatly appreciate it. I remind you, our next meeting is May 9th, the next members meeting. And next Tuesday evening, there's a special event right here at the University Club. Michelle Wucker will discuss, and she's the author of Gray Rhino, will take place here next Tuesday, if you can join us. Again, thank you so much for your panel. We are now adjourned. Thank you.